Close your eyes and picture it. The low rumble of an engine firing on a frosty morning, chrome bumpers gleaming under street lamps, the faint smell of petrol clinging to the air. Britain in the 60s and 70s was a nation on the move. Seaside trips with the boot crammed full, Sunday drives in the countryside, and kids packed shoulder to shoulder in the back, no seatbelts in sight. These cars weren't just machines. They were family members, backdrops to milestones, silent companions on the road of life. From the sleek Triumphs to the trusty Fords, they carried our stories, and then, one by one, they vanished. Today, we're revisiting classic British cars from the 60s and 70s that disappeared from our roads. How many of these beauties do you remember? If there was one car that summed up Britain in the 1960s and 1970s, it was the Ford Cortina. Launched in 1962, it quickly became more than just transport. It became the car of the people. Sleek yet affordable, it outsold rivals year after year, and by the 70s it seemed like every other driveway in Britain had one parked outside. Families remember it as the ultimate all-rounder. The Cortina was there for everything. The school run in the drizzle, the long trek to the seaside with the boot overflowing, or the Sunday drive where Dad proudly polished the bonnet before setting off. Inside, the vinyl seats clung to your legs in summer. The dials and switches felt solid and purposeful, and the smell of petrol and polish lingered faintly in the air. It wasn't luxurious, but it didn't need to be. It was dependable, stylish enough, and perfectly British. For many, it was their first car, a rite of passage. Young drivers learned to grind gears on Cortinas, while families built memories around them. From holidays in Blackpool to late-night trips with the radio crackling out pop hits of the day. Even police forces adopted them, their flashing blue lights and bold liveries making the Cortina a fixture on both suburban streets and motorways. But by the early 1980s, the Cortina's time was up. The Ford Sierra replaced it, ushering in a new aerodynamic look that left the boxy Cortina looking old-fashioned overnight. Slowly, the cars disappeared, rust claiming many, scrapyards filling with others. Yet, ask anyone who lived through the era, and the Cortina isn't just a car they recall, it's an era. It was the background hum of British life, a symbol of movement, freedom, and family. A true classic that vanished, but never from memory. The Morris Marina, launched in 1971, was never going to win awards for glamour, but it was everywhere. Designed by British Leyland as a no-nonsense rival to the Ford Cortina, the Marina was built for the everyday motorist. Affordable, boxy, and easy to repair, it quickly became one of the most common sights on British roads throughout the 70s. For many families, it was their first real step up from smaller cars. The Marina was practical, big enough to squeeze in the kids, the dog, and the weekly shopping, yet simple enough that a spanner and a bit of patience could fix most problems on the driveway. Its straight lines and unpretentious design meant it never turned heads, but to the people who drove them, that hardly mattered. What mattered was that it got you to work on Monday, to the coast on Saturday, and to Nan's house on Sunday. Inside, it was basic but familiar: vinyl bench-style seats, a simple dashboard, and the faint rattle that came with almost every journey. Kids remember sliding across the back seat as Dad took corners a bit too sharply, while mums remember loading prams and bags into the surprisingly roomy boot. The Marina might have been mocked later, branded dull, even clumsy by enthusiasts, but in its heyday, it was a car for the masses. It wasn't about prestige, it was about practicality, reliability, and owning something made in Britain. For a working family in the 70s, that counted for a lot. By the 1980s, the Marina's reputation had faded, replaced by newer, slicker models. Many succumbed to rust, and their boxy frames slowly disappeared from the roads. Still, for those who remember, the Marina wasn't just a car. It was the sound of everyday Britain, a dependable companion in a changing world. Humble, yet unforgettable. Few cars divide opinion quite like the Austin Allegro. Launched in 1973 by British Leyland, It was billed as the future of motoring, modern, innovative, and proudly British. Instead, it became one of the most ridiculed cars of its time. But here's the truth. For thousands of families in the 70s, the Allegro was simply the car they lived their lives in. It stood out immediately with its rounded, bulbous design, a world away from the boxy lines of rivals. And then there was the infamous quarter-inch steering wheel, a squarish circle meant to feel futuristic, but often leaving drivers puzzled. Still, climb inside and you'd find something familiar: vinyl seats, simple dials, and that unmistakable smell of warm upholstery and petrol that defined British cars of the era. For many, the Allegro was a first car, or the family runabout that carried them everywhere. It ferried children to school, squeezed in holiday luggage for trips to Devon, and idled outside chip shops on a Friday night while steam fogged up the windows. It may not have had speed or style, but it offered memories, laughter echoing in the back seat, arguments about maps on long journeys, the rattle of luggage as it bounced along Britain's motorways. The Allegro's reputation suffered from reliability issues and endless jokes from motoring journalists. By the mid-1980s, it had vanished from production, overtaken by sleeker, more dependable cars. Today, it's rare to see one outside of a classic car show. But for those who grew up in the 70s, the Allegro is more than a punchline. It's the smell of a damp winter morning, the clunk of a stiff gear change, and the sound of the radio buzzing out Slade or ABBA. A flawed car, yes, but also a faithful companion in Britain's motoring story. The Hillman Hunter was born in 1966, a mid-sized saloon designed by the Roots Group to rival Ford and Vauxhall. Sleek, yet understated, it quickly found its place as the car of choice for families, professionals, and even taxi drivers across Britain. By the 1970s, the Hunter had become a familiar silhouette on suburban streets and outside working men's clubs, a car that blended practicality with just enough elegance. The Hunter carried a certain quiet class. Its long bonnet, simple grille, and roomy interior made it feel bigger than it really was, while inside, the dashboard offered a clean, no-fuss layout. It wasn't flashy, but it had presence. Families remember bundling into one for weekend outings, the smell of warm leather and petrol filling the cabin, while kids in the back pressed their noses to the windows, watching the countryside roll by. One of the Hunter's proudest moments came when it won the 1968 London to Sydney Marathon, a brutal 10,000-mile endurance rally that proved its toughness. That victory gave the car a hint of glamour, a sense that this was more than just a practical saloon. It had stamina and grit. For everyday Britons, though, the Hunter was less about trophies and more about life's routines. It was the car that picked up relatives from the station, carried shopping bags from the market, and queued patiently in endless 1970s traffic jams. Taxi drivers loved it for its durability, making it a trusted sight outside train stations and airports. But by the late 70s, under Chrysler's ownership, the Hunter began to fade. Newer designs and growing competition pushed it into decline. Production finally ended in 1979, and within a decade, it had largely vanished from the roads. Still, for those who remember, the Hillman Hunter wasn't just a car. It was steady, dependable, and quietly dignified, a snapshot of Britain before the roads grew crowded with foreign imports. Launched in 1959 and running well into the 1970s, the Triumph Herald was a small car with big character. It was stylish, compact, and a touch more refined than many of its rivals, the kind of car that made you feel just a little proud when it sat outside your house. With its sharp lines penned by Italian designer Giovanni Michelotti, the Herald looked far more sophisticated than most family cars of the era, and it quickly found a loyal following in Britain. The Herald was also clever in design. Its bonnet tilted forward in one piece, giving easy access to the engine, something dads with oil-stained hands and a toolkit in the garage still remember fondly. For many, it was the car they learned to tinker with, the place where weekends were spent adjusting carburetors or replacing spark plugs. Inside, The Herald had charm. The dashboard was neat and wood-trimmed. The big steering wheel gave it a sense of importance, and the upright seating made even short journeys feel like an occasion. Families remember piling into them for holidays to Cornwall or Wales, the little Triumph buzzing gamely along winding A-roads, luggage strapped to roof racks, and kids waving at lorry drivers as they passed. The car came in many forms: saloon, coupe, estate, and convertible, which made it versatile, but it was always recognizable. Compact, stylish, and somehow cheerful in personality. By the early 70s, though, the Herald was showing its age. It was gradually replaced by the Triumph Toledo and Dolomite, and soon the once common little cars began to fade from Britain's roads. Rust claimed many, scrapyards claimed more. Yet in memory, the Herald shines brightly. It wasn't just transport, it was character on wheels. For many families, it was their first taste of motoring freedom, a modest car that carried moments too large to ever vanish. The Vauxhall Viva was exactly what its name suggested: lively, everyday, and built for the people. First launched in 1963, it was Vauxhall's answer to Britain's growing appetite for small family cars: compact, affordable, and easy to run. By the time the 1970s rolled around, the Viva had become one of the most familiar shapes on British roads, a workhorse for ordinary households. Its looks were plain but pleasant, with clean lines and a modest grille that gave it a no-nonsense charm. The Viva wasn't flashy, but it was approachable, the sort of car you'd see parked outside rows of terraced houses, at the supermarket car park, or lined up outside schools at 3 o'clock. It became the everyday hero, the quiet companion to daily life. Inside, it was basic but dependable. The vinyl seats stuck to your legs on hot days, the heater groaned in winter, and the dials flickered just enough to make you feel like you were in control of something important. For countless new drivers, the Viva was a first set of wheels, lessons learned with a nervous parent in the passenger seat, or freedom found with friends piled in, heading for a night out. The Viva wasn't about glamour, it was about memories. Trips to the seaside with buckets and spades rattling in the boot, rainy afternoons with steamed-up windows and the radio humming in the background, a reliable lift home when buses stopped running. By the early 1980s, the Viva had been replaced by the sleeker Astra, and soon its presence on Britain's roads dwindled. Many were scrapped without ceremony, their usefulness quietly outpaced by modern designs. But for those who remember, the Vauxhall Viva represents something priceless: the everyday magic of getting from A to B together. A humble car that carried a nation's ordinary, yet extraordinary, lives. The Ford Anglia was a car with quirks you couldn't forget. Produced from the late 1950s through to 1967, it carried into the early 70s as a second-hand hero, becoming the starter car for countless young drivers. Its most distinctive feature, that unmistakable backward slanting rear window, a design choice that made it instantly recognizable and, to many, oddly charming. By the 1960s, the Anglia had become a fixture on Britain's streets. Affordable, practical, and a little eccentric, it was the kind of car that quietly worked its way into everyday life. Families remember piling into one for seaside trips, the little engine buzzing as it gamely tackled long journeys. The boot barely held more than a suitcase or two, so luggage often ended up strapped to roof racks, flapping in the wind as Dad gripped the wheel with quiet determination. Inside, the Anglia was sparse but characterful. The dashboard was simple, the gear stick short and stubby, and the vinyl seats stiff but durable. Kids recall sliding across the back seat at every corner, while parents remember the clunky door handles and that familiar metallic slam when you shut it. It was no luxury motor, but it had a plucky spirit. For many, the Anglia was also a first car, cheap enough to buy second-hand, and forgiving enough for a learner's heavy clutch foot. It meant freedom, independence, and a taste of the open road. By the early 1970s, the Anglia was fading fast, replaced by the modern-looking Ford Escort. Many were scrapped, and soon The once familiar little saloon became a rare sight. Today, it's best remembered as a cultural icon, especially after its magical cameo decades later in the Harry Potter films. But long before that, the Anglia was simply Britain's cheeky little motor, quirky, dependable, and part of the rhythm of daily life. The Rover P6, launched in 1963, was a car that carried a quiet sense of prestige. Unlike the workaday Fords and Vauxhalls, the P6 was the choice of the professional class. Teachers, managers, and anyone who wanted something a little more refined without stepping into luxury. With its sharp lines, clever engineering, and comfortable ride, it felt like a car ahead of its time, a glimpse of modern motoring in the 1960s and 70s. Visually, it stood apart. Its clean, angular bodywork looked sophisticated against the boxier cars of the era, and when you saw one pull up outside an office or a suburban semi, you knew its owner had made it. Inside, it was plush by comparison. Padded seats, wood trim, and a dashboard that looked like it belonged in an aircraft more than a family saloon. Slip behind the wheel, and you felt important. For many families, the P6 wasn't just transport, it was pride on four wheels. Children remember sliding into the back, inhaling the faint smell of polished leather and petrol, while dads felt a quiet satisfaction turning the ignition, knowing they were driving something special. Whether it was gliding down motorways or pulling up outside a restaurant, the Rover P6 carried a sense of occasion. Its engineering matched its looks. Independent suspension and disc brakes gave it performance that was ahead of rivals, and in V8 form, it could truly shift. It wasn't just a car for getting around, it was a car for enjoying the journey. But by the late 1970s, the P6 was showing its age. Replaced by the Rover SD1, it soon disappeared from Britain's roads, many succumbing to rust and the scrapyard. Still, for those who remember, the P6 represents a moment when British cars could be innovative, elegant, and deeply aspirational. A motor that whispered success in a very British way. The Austin Maxi, introduced in 1969, was a car that tried to be clever, and in its own way, it was. Marketed as Britain's first true hatchback, the Maxi offered something unusual for its time. Space, versatility, and practicality, all wrapped in a modest, unassuming shell. It wasn't glamorous, but it was useful, and for countless families in the 1970s, that made it a quiet favorite. The Maxi was instantly recognizable for its rather square, upright shape. Not the prettiest car on the road, perhaps, but step inside and you discovered its secret: a roomy interior with a rear seat that could fold flat, creating a bed-like space. Families remember long trips to the seaside or the countryside, with kids lying down in sleeping bags in the back while the car hummed steadily along A roads. For some, it was their first taste of adventure travel, camping on wheels, Maxi style. The 5-speed gearbox was another innovation, giving it a touch more flexibility than many rivals. Dads who fancied themselves as car enthusiasts proudly pointed it out, even as the gearbox sometimes felt stiff or stubborn. Inside, the Maxi smelled of warm vinyl and petrol, with a dashboard that was simple but functional. It wasn't luxury, but it didn't pretend to be. It was about making life easier. What people remember most, though, was its role in everyday life. Trips to B&Q with planks poking out the hatch, family holidays with the boot groaning under the weight of luggage, prams, and picnic baskets. Kids sprawled across the back on long journeys, whispering and giggling as the car rumbled on. By the 1980s, newer hatchbacks like the Volkswagen Golf made the Maxi look outdated. Production ended in 1981, and soon they disappeared from Britain's roads. Yet, the Maxi holds a special place in memory, not for glamour or speed, but for practicality. It was the car that quietly made family life simpler, an unsung workhorse of the 1970s. The Hillman Avenger arrived in 1970 with bold ambitions. Built under the Roots Group, later Chrysler UK, it was designed to compete with the likes of the Ford Escort and Vauxhall Viva, and for a while it did. With its neat styling, solid performance, and wide range of trims, the Avenger carved out a place in Britain's motoring landscape during the 1970s. From the outside, it looked modern for its day. Sharp lines, a tidy grille, and a stance that gave it confidence without pretension. Families bought them by the thousands, and it quickly became a common sight in suburban driveways, parked outside factories, or lined up at football grounds on a Saturday afternoon. Inside, it was straightforward and practical. Simple controls, vinyl seats that grew sticky in the sun, and a dashboard that always seemed just a little rattly. But it worked. For many, the Avenger was the car of family life. It hauled camping gear to Devon, ferried kids to school, and joined queues of traffic heading for the seaside. Teenagers remember piling into the back after nights out, while parents recall the reassuring hum of the engine on long journeys. It was unpretentious but dependable, exactly what Britain needed at the time. The Avenger also had its lively side. In GT form, it offered a bit more speed, and rally versions proved surprisingly capable, showing the car had more spirit than its modest appearance suggested. Still, for most owners, it was simply about everyday use, about getting from A to B without fuss. By the late 1970s, though, the Avenger began to fade. Competition was fierce, and the arrival of sleeker foreign models left it looking old-fashioned. Production finally ended in 1981, and soon the once ubiquitous Avenger became a rare sight. Yet in memory, it remains a symbol of the era, a modest, honest car that carried families through the heart of 1970s Britain. The Wolseley 18/85 was a car that carried an air of quiet authority. Launched in the late 1960s as part of the BMC Landcrab range, it was larger, roomier, and a little more refined than many of its contemporaries. To see one parked outside a house in the 70s was to know its owner valued comfort and a touch of class, even if they weren't wealthy. It wasn't a flashy car, but it was dignified. Its design was boxy and wide, giving it that unmistakable land crab nickname. But the Wolseley badge added a sense of respectability. The grille, upright and smart with its illuminated badge, seemed to hint at middle-class aspiration. Step inside, and you were met with wood veneer trim, deep seats, and a sense that this was more than just a way to get from A to B. It was a car that felt solid, steady, and respectable. Families remember the 1885s as a comfortable cruiser. Long trips felt calmer thanks to its hydroelastic suspension, which soaked up Britain's bumpy roads. The cabin smelled of leather and polish, and the steady hum of the engine filled journeys with a kind of reassurance. For children, the wide rear bench meant plenty of room to sprawl out on holiday trips. For parents, it was a car that said, "We've moved up in the world." The Wolseley 18/85 mattered because it wasn't just transport, it was a statement. It suggested stability, modest success, and a sense of pride in driving something British. By the mid-1970s, however, the Wolseley name was fading. The 1885s was quietly dropped in 1975 as British Leyland rationalized its brands. Soon after, the badge itself disappeared, taking with it a whole chapter of British motoring heritage. Today, the Wolseley 1885 survives only in the memories of those who saw its glowing badge at night or rode in its wide, comfortable cabin. A car that was never loud, but always proud. The Singer Vogue was a car that quietly straddled two worlds: practical family saloon and aspirational motor for those who wanted just a touch more refinement. Introduced in the early 1960s as part of the Roots Group's range, the Vogue was essentially the more upmarket sibling to the Hillman Minx. By the time the 1970s arrived, it was still a familiar sight on British roads, a car that offered understated elegance without the high price tag of true luxury marques. Its styling was neat and well-proportioned, with gentle curves and a front grille that looked tidy and reassuringly solid. The two-tone paintwork, often seen on earlier models, gave it a cheerful yet distinguished air. Inside, the Vogue offered little luxuries that mattered at the time: wood veneer trim, comfortable seats, and a sense of polish that made families feel they were stepping into something a little special. For many, the Singer Vogue wasn't about speed or flashiness, but about pride. It was the car that took families on Sunday drives to the countryside, with tartan rugs and thermos flasks packed in the boot. It was the car that ferried proud parents to weddings and graduations, the polished chrome gleaming in photographs. Children remember the steady rhythm of its engine on long journeys, the scent of warm fabric and petrol, and the gentle sway as it rolled along Britain's A roads. The Vogue represented a kind of modest aspiration, proof that a family could have something a step above ordinary without breaking the bank. It wasn't extravagant, but it carried a quiet dignity. By the mid-1970s, though, the Singer name itself was retired, absorbed into the larger Chrysler brand. The Vogue disappeared along with it, fading into history as newer, more modern designs took its place. Yet, for those who knew it, the Singer Vogue remains a reminder of a gentler time, when cars weren't just about horsepower, but about pride, polish, and presence. The Daimler Sovereign was the sort of car that made people stop and look. Based on the Jaguar, but given the Daimler badge, it was introduced in the late 1960s and carried through the 1970s as a statement of quiet wealth and refinement. For many, it wasn't just a car, it was a symbol of success, the kind of motor that glided down leafy suburban streets or pulled up outside country houses with authority. Its design was elegant, with long, sweeping lines, a bold chrome grille, and that unmistakable Daimler fluting on the bonnet. The Sovereign looked every inch the gentleman's car, less brash than some luxury rivals, but undeniably dignified. Inside, it was a world of wood and leather, thick carpets underfoot, and dials that gleamed like the instruments of a fine watch. Slip into the driver's seat, and you felt cocooned in British craftsmanship. For families who owned one, the Daimler Sovereign wasn't just transport, it was pride. It carried brides to weddings, executives to boardrooms, and children to school with an air of quiet ceremony. The deep growl of its engine was smooth and reassuring, and passengers remember the way it seemed to float over the road, insulated from the bumps and rattles of ordinary cars. The Sovereign mattered because it represented aspiration. It was the car of company directors, of respected professionals, of those who had made it. To see one parked outside a home was to know a family had climbed a rung on the ladder of life. By the late 1970s and into the 80s, the Daimler name began to fade as Jaguar took center stage, and soon Sovereigns vanished from everyday sight. Many were lost to time, replaced by newer executive cars. But for those who remember, the Daimler Sovereign is more than a memory of chrome and leather. It's a reminder of when British luxury had a quiet confidence all its own. Few cars summed up the playful, eccentric side of Britain in the 1970s, quite like the Bond Bug. Launched in 1970, this little three-wheeler wasn't about practicality or prestige. It was about fun. With its bright orange paint, wedge-shaped body, and lift-up canopy instead of conventional doors, the Bug looked more like something from a sci-fi comic than a car you'd spot on the high street. And that was the point. Designed under Reliant, the Bond Bug was aimed squarely at young drivers who wanted something cheap, cheerful, and completely different. With only 3 wheels and a tiny engine, it wasn't built for speed, but it had a cheeky character that drew attention everywhere it went. If you drove a Bug, you weren't just getting from A to B, you were making a statement. People remember the Bond Bug for the sheer joy it brought, the sensation of climbing in through the canopy, dropping into the low-slung seats, and hearing the little engine buzz to life. It was quirky, impractical, and sometimes a bit shaky on corners, but it never failed to make people smile. Onlookers would stop and stare, kids would point excitedly, and owners felt like they were part of something special. The Bug embodied the optimism and individuality of the early 70s. It wasn't about blending in. It was about standing out. For a generation who couldn't afford a sports car, it offered a taste of that thrill in miniature form. By 1974, production ended, and only a few thousand were ever built. Today, they're rare collector's items, cherished by enthusiasts who remember their boldness. The Bond bug may have vanished from our roads, but its spirit lives on, proof that sometimes the cars we love most aren't the most practical, but the ones that dared to be different. Looking back at these cars, it's not just the machines we remember, it's the lives that unfolded around them. They were more than metal and wheels. They were the backdrop to weddings and holidays, to first loves and first jobs, to laughter-filled journeys and quiet moments on the open road. Each one tells a story of Britain in the 1960s and 70s, a time of change, of hope, of grit and charm. They may have vanished from our roads, but not from our memories. If any of these cars stirred something in you, you're not alone. Share your memories in the comments. Which one did your family drive? Or which do you wish you could bring back? And if you'd like to keep these memories alive, this is your place. Subscribe and join us as we journey deeper into the forgotten corners of Britain's past. Because some things may vanish, but they're never truly gone as long as we remember them.